got it what, got it what. Yeah, I never see you anymore. Got it what, got it what, got it what. I'll make you all out of.
Hello, welcome to Lecture 6. This is part 1 of Lecture 6, and I'm still Michaelis Michael, and we've done most of the technical stuff. We're in a position now to apply it to some philosophy. We saw a bit of that by extension when we talked about vagueness in Lecture 5. And today we're going to be talking about a whole bunch of topics that are also connected to what we've done. We'll be talking about Frege and Wittgenstein on meaning and the idea of truth conditions and the way the uses we make of bits of language constitute their meaning. In part 2 we'll talk about in broad scheme about skepticism, science and knowledge, and this is part 1, so here we go. Okay, part 1. They're the thinker's feet, photographed outside Columbia University Philosophy Department in New York City. I took that photo, which I quite like. Okay, so part 1 we're going to be talking about Frege and Wittgenstein. I'll say quite a bit about them. There's a video on the Moodle site that you should watch. It's with David Kaplan. There may well be questions related to it, so do pay attention. This is Gottlob Frege. This is him as a young man. He was a 19th century and early 20th century mathematician and philosopher, and he was forced into doing philosophy in a way by problems that he had as a mathematician of trying to clarify when proofs are actually correct. He came to see that there are steps that are taken in mathematical proofs that are really not obvious, and because of that unclarity in the concepts involved, it wasn't clear whether the claims being made on the basis of those steps were actually correct, and this was a problem that he faced. So how can you tell if a mathematical proof is correct? So he developed what he called the Begriffsschrift. Begriffsschrift literally means concept begriff. Schrift is the writing, so concept writing. And it's an attempt to develop a language which made inferences really clear. I mentioned Frege when I talked at the beginning about propositional logic, because in fact the formal language that you've learnt in the truth tables is actually a descendant of the language he developed in the Begriffsschrift. So the language with those symbols and with the meanings that they've got is actually a descendant of his language that he developed. But it's actually syntactically a little bit different, because only the turnstile, which we use to mean is therefore, is the only thing that directly comes from his Begriffsschrift. There are terms in there with the same meanings, but they don't look the same. Frege's language had two primitives that he defined everything else in terms of, and they didn't look like ours. He had the two primitives, negation, which is our tilde, and the conditional, which is our arrow, but they didn't look at all like ours. One thing you notice by looking at the way his sentences look is that it's a two-dimensional structure. In particular, if A then B is not written on a straight line, right? It's a two-dimensional object. And that led to problems. People didn't really like using his formal language. It was a not a very common sort of language. And it led to having sentences like these, right? The idea of having these two-dimensional sentences, right? Each of these is a sentence, really put people off, and many people didn't use it. Though, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, and some people love it so much they get tattoos of Frege's language. So here's a tattoo I found online of someone who had a statement of Cantor's theorem as a tattoo. I really hope that they know logic, because, anyway. Right, so Frege for us is really important because he had an enormous number of really powerful insights. Like many of his powerful insights, hindsight makes them look obvious, right? But it's far from obvious, in fact, and it took a great amount of insight in being able to see things clearly to make that distinction. One of the important distinctions that he made was to distinguish between the content of a judgment, literally what is asserted, and the act of assertion itself. So the content is one thing, asserting it is a different thing. And traditionally, logicians influenced by Aristotle thought that it was the copula, the is that we have been using, or is not, that carries the assertion. Traditionally, logicians have said that it's the use of the copula that moves it from just a list into something which is asserted. So to say that Max is sitting is to assert of Max that he has the property of sitting, and to say Max is not sitting is to deny of Max that he is sitting. And that was the traditional understanding of the important role of the copula, is and is not, in shaping assertion and denial. Well, here comes Frege. Frege says this traditional view is just wrong, and it confuses the content of the judgment with the act of assertion itself. So Frege says, look, you can assert that Max is not sitting just as much as you can assert that Max is sitting, and you can deny either just as easily. So neither the content of those two sentences, Max is sitting and Max is not sitting, the content is not tied to assertion or denial at all. So he says that negation, that is not that, or the not part that the traditional logicians thought of as being part of the denial, he says, no, this is not part of assertion or denial. This is part of the content of the judgment. And you can assert or deny any content at all, but not just that. It's not just you can assert or deny any content. You can have all sorts of other attitudes to it as well. You can wonder whether it's true. You can suspect that it's true. You can fear that it's true. These are all different attitudes that we can take to contents. And assertion and denial are just two of those. Another important thing that Frege was radical about was that he was completely rejecting the traditional story of what sentences actually said. The Frege maintained, and he was the first to do this, and today linguists follow him in accepting that the transformation between active and passive don't change meanings, don't change what is said. So here's Frege's example. At Plataea, the Greeks defeated the Persians. That's the active form. And the second, at Plataea, the Persians were defeated by the Greeks. Now, traditionally, and this is influenced again by Aristotle, because these are taken to be saying different things because they have different subjects and predicates. The first one has the Greeks as the subjects, the second one has the Persians as the subject. And traditionally, these were saying different things about different things. Frege rejected actually thinking in terms of the subject and predicate, grammatically speaking, as being the logical subject. And he argued this was actually a very misleading aspect of language. For Frege, these two sentences say the same thing because they're implied by the same sentences and they imply the same sentences. So this suggests the idea that the content is actually tied to logical power, what you can infer from it and what you can infer it from. And if they're similar in their logical power, then they say the same thing. So, and that insight, the idea that two sentences have the same content if they behave logically the same way, you get beginnings of whole schools of theories of meaning. It's a further step is to say that if an argument is valid, if all the circumstances in which the premises are all true, the conclusion is true too, right? That ties the content to the conditions under which the sentences are true. And again, this is the idea at the root of a number of semantic theories, theories of meaning. And it's encapsulated in the idea that the meaning of a sentence is the way the world has to be for that sentence to be true. And put like that, I would say that that's a very plausible theory. So here's a radical idea then put forward not by Frege but by someone he hugely influenced, Wittgenstein, particularly early Wittgenstein. The meaning of a sentence is its truth conditions, what the world has to be like for the sentence to be true. And this is captured in the truth tables we saw in giving the semantics for the connectives in yesterday's lecture, in lecture number 5, in case you were binging the lectures or maybe dragging them out or something. To give you an idea of how influential Frege was on Wittgenstein, among his last words were, if only I could have written like Frege. And his actual last utterance was, tell them I had a wonderful life. All right. So I want to say something now about Wittgenstein and his wonderful life. Here's Ludwig Wittgenstein with his family. He's on the extreme right. He was a hugely influential philosopher. He was raised in extreme wealth and very high culture in Vienna. His father, in the middle there at the back, was one of the richest people in Europe. His brother was a one-armed pianist. He's the second from the left. It's his brother Paul, and Wittgenstein's on the far right. Gustav Klimt painted Ludwig's sister. Here she is. She's called Mrs. Stoneborough because that was her married name. Ravel wrote his piano concerto for the left hand for Ludwig's brother Paul. And Paul, like all three of his brothers, committed suicide, and he himself was all his life tortured by thoughts of suicide. and he inherited his father's wealth, um, but actually he gave all the wealth away, since he thought wealth corrupts. So in fact, he was so poor that when he wanted to travel back to Cambridge after giving all his money away, he had to get Bertrand Russell to sell the furniture that he had in storage in Cambridge and to send him the money for the ticket. And, you know, he thought that money corrupted, so what did he do with his money? Well, he gave it to his sister. His sister, after all, had already been corrupted, so a little more money wouldn't corrupt her more. This is the book that he wrote, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, and in this book he defined truth tables like the ones that you've learnt about in Lecture 5. Frege did not have truth tables. Wittgenstein was the one who invented them. And this book is one of the most enigmatic books ever written. It's actually written while he was a prisoner of war in the First World War. So the book is not laid out in a normal manner, but rather like this. This is actually the first, I don't know, few sentences of it. You can see it's structured like a set of comments on comments. The world is all that is the case. The world is totality of facts, not of things, and the world is determined by the facts, and there being all the facts, etc., etc. Very enigmatic. Had a huge influence as soon as it was published. And the account of meaning in this book is what is called the picture theory of language. It's the idea that when we use language, we picture, or we attempt to picture, reality. So when we assert a sentence, we're saying that the world is the way pictured in the sentence. The sentences are like pictures of a possible world, and we're saying, yeah, this is what the world is like. So when we assert Brazil is bigger than Australia, we picture a way the world could be, and we commit ourselves to the world's being that way. I should say that phrase, a way the world could be, is important, and you should have done the weekend exercise, and there's a video and explaining it from what my perspective that you should look at as well, that phrase figures importantly in. Okay, so we've got these sentences, and then we've got the connectives which relate to operations on these ways the world could be. As he puts it, the expression of agreement or disagreement with the truth possibilities of elementary propositions, they're the basic ones, expresses the truth conditions of a proposition. A proposition is the expression of its truth conditions. Okay, and there you have the statement of the truth conditional account of meaning. Now, Wittgenstein finishes the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus with Proposition 7, which is now a very famous sentence. He says, "What we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence." This book, very short book, was enigmatic, and it influenced all sorts of people, artists and poets and composers, and also philosophers. And he was associated with the Vienna Circle, a group of scientifically minded, left-wing and progressive philosophers in Vienna. And he also was adopted by the logical positivists, and he disagreed with all of them. He thought they'd misunderstood him, and they kept trying to get him to come and talk to them. And Menger, in his account of his time in the Vienna Circle, talks about how when Wittgenstein would come and talk to them, he would piss them off by actually sitting facing away from them and reading poetry to them. They didn't appreciate that. They actually wanted to ask him questions and to get clear what he was trying to say. So he's actually quite unique in philosophers, in fact, because although he thought that when he published the Tractatus that it would finish philosophy, there was nothing else to do, that as he says in the preface, anyone who reads this and understands this will realize that he's solved the problems of philosophy forever. Yeah, so he was a pretty confident sort of a chap. Well, he came to see that he was woefully wrong about that that first book did not solve the problems of philosophy. In fact, that it was completely confused. And he developed a second really influential philosophical vision. And this second was actually an attack on the first. When he returned to philosophy in 1930 after a spell as a school teacher in the wilds, he was asked to submit the Tractatus, which had already been published, as a PhD, so could be given a job at Cambridge, and he agreed to do that. But the classes that he started giving at Cambridge showed that he was already moving radically away from the picture of meaning in the Tractatus. What the positivists and Wittgenstein of this period had in common was the motto that meaning is use. But in fact, the motto, the glib motto, doesn't actually tell you what it means, right? And they actually interpreted it differently and certainly used it differently. The positivists interpret it as saying that the meaning of a sentence is the conditions under which we can recognize it as true. And the idea they had was that if you're given a sentence and want to know what it means, then the thing to do is to ask what you can observe that will show you that the sentence is true. And that's the idea that what would verify it. And so the verification conditions were thought to be crucial to giving the meaning of a sentence. And any sentence then which doesn't have verification conditions, according to the positivists, had no meaning, and because of that was meaningless. And this is the idea that's really influential in developing one important understanding of science. We'll see later in part 2 of this where this goes wrong. Wittgenstein's view was actually quite different. His account of meaning of use is not about verification, but actually what we do with bits of language. And in particular, he has this important focus on being trained up in a use of a bit of language. So the use of a bit of language is about entering into a way of living, a way of using this in your life. And he has this phrase, a form of life. And for Wittgenstein, putting use at the center of his story about understanding means that when explanations end, what has happened is that what we've traced back our explanations to the ways in which of interpreting what is significant, the language, the gestures, exactly, etc., which is actually not about propositions, about things that can be true and false, but rather tied to what you actually do. And for this reason, to understand a bit of language, Wittgenstein says that you must also share a form of life. So he says, and this is actually quite surprising, he says in the second great book that he wrote, The Philosophical Investigations, if a lion could talk, we could not understand him. Right? The thing to notice about this quote is that it's not that we can't understand the words, or we don't recognize the words. The words might actually look like English, right? But the crucial thing here is that it's not that the words we don't understand, but the lion. Right? So the question is, what role was the lion making? Make use of, what use was it making of those words? What role did that act play in the lion's aims and goals? And once again, it's the idea that the idea of understanding the use of language as an action. Right? I've emphasized that before, and I think that's something to take really seriously, that understanding a linguistic act is to understand an aspect of that actor. So once again, Wittgenstein is of the view that if you don't share a form of life with your interlocutor, then you don't understand just what move they've made with those words. So even seeing what they did as asserting as opposed to ordering or wondering or questioning is actually part of linguistic action. So is it clear that we can't understand the lion? Well, I don't think it is clear. But what is correct, and I think Wittgenstein is important in pointing this out, is that it's not clear that we can understand it either. What seems right in any case is that making sense of one another is actually making sense of the way we use language intentionally. And when we do that, we solve all at once for the question of what the words mean, but also what did they intend to achieve with their action. And that is not straightforward. And it's only shown to be not straightforward when it becomes difficult. We take it for granted in most of our linguistic interactions. Okay, that was the end of part 1. Stay tuned and we'll see part 2. Bye.